Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, November 17th. And we are in the last couple of weeks of the liturgical year. So you might think, well, the new year isn't until January 1st, but the liturgical new year will start on December 1st with Advent. And so we're at the very end. So this Sunday, all the readings are going to be about tribulation and distress and the final judgment. And then that will lead us to the following Sunday, a week from today, will be the Feast of Christ the King. And it depicts and focuses on Jesus as coming as, in the second coming, as King and Sovereign and final Judge, to judge the living and the dead. And so the readings will pick up this week from the book of Revelation. And so the church is getting us to see and think about the final end of the world and our own final end, which will come maybe before, maybe not, the end of the world. So that all comes together. And so the readings are about distress. And so one of the things I want us to get our minds around the context of these readings, the first reading will be from the book of Daniel, and it'll talk about distress. Now, the book of Daniel comes towards the very end of the Old Covenant. And Israel goes through a growing tribulation. They fall under the Babylonian Empire, then the Medo-Persian, then the Greeks, and then finally the Romans. And during the Romans, that's when the Messiah will come, the first coming of Jesus. And then the Romans will destroy in judgment Jerusalem and scatter Israel and the Jews. And so you see this ratcheting up of tribulation, distress, and conflict in the last several hundred years of the Old Covenant. And that last several hundred years is kind of like the last age. And it's an age of conflict, of tribulation, where the sins of Israel now are growing, and yet grace is growing too in the midst of tribulation. And so you'll see the Maccabean martyrs, who are the most heroic Jews who are faithful to the Torah and die for the sake of the law. And then you'll see, of course, Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the apostles in the midst of the time of Rome. And so there's a heightened sense of judgment and tribulation, and yet grace, where sin abounds, as Paul says, grace abounds even more. And that will likewise happen at the end of the New Covenant. At the end of the New Covenant, it will be an age of growing tribulation and distress, that will come in waves, just like it did with the Babylonians and then the Greeks and the Medo-Persians. And, there's this time of tribulation, and there's rest, and then a heightened conflict and tribulation. And that will mark the end of the New Covenant era. So in the end of the New Covenant, there'll be tribulations that will grow and grow until finally the second coming will happen. And so we see that. So the book of Daniel talks about this time of unsurpassed distress that will happen at the end of the Old Covenant era. And there'll be a judgment, and yet some will arise in this final resurrection to glory, and some to everlasting judgment and horror. And so you get that sense of judgment, and you don't want to be with the wicked. That's what Daniel's warning about. And then you have Psalm 16, which is a great psalm. I think about this as a psalm that's used for Jesus' own tribulation, death, and resurrection. And it's also a great psalm to pray with those who are dying, to give them the hope of resurrection. And so this is a psalm that I always think about if we're praying with somebody on their deathbed. This is a psalm I always like to go to. Psalm 16 and Psalm 23 are my two favorite psalms to pray with people before death. And those are the psalms I plan to pray myself if I'm on my deathbed, and it's the psalms I've prayed with others in their last moments and days. And so the church gives us that as we think about the end. And then the second reading from the epistle to the Hebrews talks about Jesus' high priesthood, and that he takes his seat forever at God's right hand until his enemies become his footstool, which is an allusion to Psalm 2. And so Jesus as priest and enthroned. And of course, that prepares us for next week when he will be enthroned as the king making final judgment. And then we have the gospel reading where Jesus talks about the sun, the moon, and the stars being darkened. And then he says this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. And so some people think, well, wait a minute, didn't Jesus say the sun, the moon, and the stars would be darkened? It's the end of space and time. But that metaphor actually comes from the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 13, speaking about the end of the Babylonian kingdom because of their sins. They will be judged. And what Jesus is saying here is the idea of sun, moon, and stars being darkened is not the end of space and time necessarily, but the end of time for a particular kingdom, because judgment is coming upon that kingdom in particular. And that's what's true with Babylon. When Babylon is judged, the sun, the moon, and the stars don't go away. That image becomes a prophetic sign of judgment for the end of time for that kingdom, because people in the ancient world kept time by the sun for the hour, by the stars for the season, and by the moon for the seasons and the months. And so the idea is that their time is up. And this generation will not pass away. Jesus is saying there's going to be a great time of judgment upon this generation, and it's going to happen within 40 years. And 40 years to the day, almost 40 years to that year, Rome destroys Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jesus gives this discourse in 30 AD, and in 70 AD, Jerusalem and Israel is judged by the Romans. And so Jesus' prophetic word does find its literal fulfillment. And then what happens in 70 AD becomes, and that generation becomes a sign of what will happen at the end of the world. There'll be an apocalyptic judgment upon the whole world. So what happens to Jerusalem as a city and Israel as a nation will happen to all nations, because Israel is judged at the end of the old covenant, but the old covenant was just with one nation. But the new covenant will be with all nations. And so that judgment will be global and it will be worldwide. And so we see this as kind of a precursor to the final judgment. And so the church is warning us. And the idea that the sun, the moon, and the stars being darkened is a prophetic sign. You could think of the prophetic sign of Fatima. You know, when the children and the crowds see the sun dancing and darkened, and everyone can look with their eyes at the sun, and it looks like the sun's falling upon the earth during that sign of Fatima, that's a sign that Jesus is warning about the end of the ages, and that the sun, the moon, and the stars will be darkened before the coming tribulation and judgment. Fatima in 1917 is a sign, and it's a sign that we are entering into the last age. But that last age will be an age. It could be like the last age of the Old Covenant that lasts several hundred years. And so with tribulations growing in rounds, and so World War II, World War I, and World War II, and then as these kind of moments, just like the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, there was 4 major waves of tribulation. World War I, World War II, certainly 2 of those great waves of tribulation. So maybe we're in the midst of this age, and the church is warning us, be vigilant. Be vigilant. And the readings we're going to see this week are all about vigilance in preparation for the end of the age. And the way to prepare for the end of the age, we're going to get over the next 2 weeks in the readings. And it's not by hoarding up water and stocking up on food. We're going to see what Jesus says, how we should prepare ourselves and our souls for the end. May the Lord make you sober and make you grow in faith in whatever time of tribulation we live in. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.